Welcome to the Omnibus Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a state representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota. Walter Hudson joins me again to co-host the show this week, where we talk about House File 2423, which is the constitutional amendment that I offered in the Minnesota House, which would allow counties to vote to join neighboring states. Then we discuss whether or not the governor should be allowed to infringe on civil liberties by issuing a stay-at-home order or curfew. We'll discuss the pros and cons and how this impacts people's First Amendment privilege to get out and protest peacefully. Then Walter Hudson heads to Wisconsin, a state recently freed by the Wisconsin Supreme Court as they've ruled against the governor's unconstitutional mask mandate. We discuss the pros and cons of this, and of course, Wisconsin being the last state surrounding Minnesota to actually have a mask mandate. Then we jump into discussing vaccine passports and whether or not the government or individual businesses should be able to discriminate against someone who has not been vaccinated, even people who have had the disease naturally. All this and more on the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. All right. Well, last Thursday, I introduced a bill in the Minnesota House that would have, it was a constitutional amendment that would allow counties to each vote on whether to join a neighboring state. In other words, if you're a county that's neighboring, let's say you're Polk County in northwestern Minnesota, where East Grand Forks is, and you really consider yourself part of Grand Forks and you do all your business there and you're sick of regulations in St. Paul, in government overtaxing you when your neighbors just down the street are in a completely different environment. This bill would allow your county to vote to join North Dakota. And the process works by allowing counties to vote to join a neighboring state. Once we get all the counties voting and decide what our border should be, then we have Congress in D.C. approve that new border line. And this follows what 5 counties in Oregon are doing, where they'll be voting on joining Idaho in May. This bill, I introduced it because a lot of people have been asking what it takes to join another state, because so many people in our communities are leaving and moving to other states. And this bill would allow people to stay in our communities, but we would just choose a different governance, right? Better governance. So this started a little Twitter firestorm, and I'm not a Twitter guy because most of the people out there, about 80% of them are liberal, but got a lot of activity on Twitter and Facebook, and South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem retweeted it and welcomed us to South Dakota if we went down that path. So Walter, what as a guy on the outside of the Capitol, did you hear about this bill, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely heard about it. And I think it's hilarious that because you dropped this, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and we've recorded a couple of podcasts since then and haven't talked about it. That's what's amazing, is that something so bold and dramatic of a proposal had to wait in queue for us to get around to it, because we've had more higher priority content. But yeah, no, this is fantastic. I love it. I love it for a number of reasons. I think the primary one is it's a fantastic example of setting the narrative, which is something that our side folks on the right simply do not do as a rule. Republicans and conservatives are reactionary, and this is a pun. I don't mean that in the political sense of the word. I mean that they react to the things that happen. They sit and passively wait, and then the left does something, and then they react. The left wants to do this, and this is our answer. And that's how we develop this reputation of being the party of no, because we're never proposing anything. We're just constantly responding to the proposals of the left. And so when we respond with no, it creates this narrative that we're negative Nancys who never want to do anything. Well, the way we get around that is by being proactive and proposing things that force them to say no. And then you actually have a back and forth conversation about the direction public policy ought to go. So I like this proposal for that reason. On top of that, I just like the proposal itself. I like the idea of local municipalities having the ability to push back against the overreach of the state. The state of Minnesota, and in particular, the population centers in the quote unquote urban core, Minneapolis, St. Paul, but you could also include Duluth, you could include Rochester, these urban central planning areas of the state take it for granted that the rest of the state will and should just go along with whatever it is that they want to do and supplement it. Now, multiple topics that we've talked about on this podcast, whether you're talking about education or you're talking about the law enforcement, the Chauvin trial, defund the police, you go down the list. And issue after issue, Minneapolis and St. Paul believe that the rest of us exist to service them. We get nothing in exchange, but we're supposed to service them. And this is a way to say, no, we're not playing that. We're going to go over to South Dakota and be free.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on how reactionary Republicans typically are. If there's one thing that we've learned from Donald Trump that we should maintain, we can learn from politically, it's if you want to talk about an important topic, which for me is the disparity between states, right? I live in southwestern Minnesota. We are competing against South Dakota and Iowa, whether it's agriculture regulations, taxes, everything else. We're competing against them. That's why businesses up and move, and people in the community, and take their jobs with them. And I've been up in St. Paul talking about this for 3 years. People aren't paying attention, right? So by introducing a bill like this, when I look up this story, there's over 100 newspapers and TV stations that have done articles about this. And when they call me, originally there was an attack like, Munson wants people to leave Minnesota. No, I want people to stay in our communities. Like that's what this bill's about. It's about maintaining people in our communities and better governance. And maybe we should be talking about the disparities, in taxes and regulations. And now, as Trump does, where you make a splash in the media, people pay attention, then you can talk about your issue. And I didn't have any marketing done for this. I talked with my media person at the Capitol and said, hey, maybe you want to create a graphic so that when the bill's introduced, we could just kind of, do a social media post about it. And so she said, well, what do you want it to look like? I said, well, just drop a map of Minnesota and show some counties moving to South Dakota as an example, right? It's not a South Dakota specific bill. People could move to North Dakota or Wisconsin or Iowa, but let's just show what it would look like. And she said, well, do you want to be included in this? Sure. Just bring it over to 35W. I didn't know it was going to be the whole state, but it's a graphical interpretation of what could happen. Meanwhile, the reporter from Minnesota Public Radio News evidently stayed up all night writing this long article about how Munson chose, 56 counties. And I'm like, I didn't choose these counties, but way overanalyzed it and didn't even come up with the reason didn't talk about the real issues, right? They talked about the average income and the voting records, and people think I'm gerrymandering by this. Like, no, this is about, the economic disparity in states.
Well, what it is, here's what they did. They looked at it through the lens of what their strategy would be, right? So it's total projection. If they had come up with something like this, there would be shenanigans, right? They would be gerrymandering. They would be looking at some other angle that isn't part of the actual articulated proposal. You put out something and you just mean what you say. It is what it is. I want to give people the option to, if they so choose, secede from Minnesota and join another state. That's it. End of thought process, end of story. And they can't handle that. There must be something else to it. No, we just like freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Jeremy.
Yeah, Shane.
On that too, just for people that have these questions and that sort of thing, how would this affect the electoral votes, say, for presidential election between Minnesota and South Dakota?
Well, if these counties were to secede, my guess is the negotiation with the legislature would be that we would be leaving our electoral votes behind. Unless we were to try to do we couldn't get this done now, right? It's too late for census, but maybe perhaps that would be, you'd have to redraw it. But basically we would be taking, if they do census by precinct, we would know how many people live in each precinct. So those precincts would move over to South Dakota, and then we could recalculate the number of electoral votes. Congressional redistricting, all that kind of stuff would occur.
Sure.
And, likely we would bring over 2 congressional votes, so 2 electoral votes to South Dakota. I think they have 1 congressperson now. So then maybe they would get 2 more, or maybe just 1 more, depending on how many counties, or maybe there's only 4 counties that go. I don't know how many would move. But yeah, somebody else asked me, I did a podcast with some people, some students from South Dakota, and they said, well, would Minnesota still be the land of 10,000 lakes? And I said, well, I think we've got like 15,000 lakes here, so we've got some to spare.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's a fantastic idea, both practically and politically, in terms of moving the conversation. And the proof is in the pudding. The fact that you've gotten the reaction that you have, that you've put them in a position where they have to react, and now they have to defend things that they weren't ready to defend. Right? Like, so one of the counter arguments that I've seen online with this, and like you, I've tried to keep out of comment sections and whatnot, because that's not where the highest discussion tends to occur. But you hear things like, well, why don't you just move there? If you like South Dakota so much, why don't you just move there? And to your point, it's like, no, I shouldn't have to move to escape your tyranny. The idea that Minneapolis wants me to subsidize their absurd law enforcement policy and their failing education system. Therefore, in order to escape that, I have to leave my house and leave my community and pull up the roots that I've spent however long laying. That's an immoral suggestion. And so you're forcing people with this bill to expose the fact that they want you to suffer under their dictates and under their rule. And they hate the idea that you might actually be able to slip out from under the thumb that they've placed over you.
Yeah, and I've been talking with a few senators trying to figure out if it's something that we really want to push at the legislature to have a conversation on. Being in the minority in the House, I can't hold a hearing on it, but in the Senate, they absolutely could, and they could have a Senate hearing that lasted hours, where they have all these testifiers come in to talk about the disparity, talk about the ethanol plant in my district that waited for years to get a permit to expand its operation for renewable fuels. Meanwhile, in Iowa, just 40 miles south, they can get a permit to double capacity in just a few months. Or the different chemicals that you use in farming that are more available in other states than in Minnesota, where there's restrictions put on place. The True Shrimp, the big indoor shrimp farm that was going to be, millions and millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs, was supposed to come to southwestern Minnesota. And even they got funding from the state. And then the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency said no to the water that they needed for their plant. So they moved to South Dakota. All these businesses were leaving. Liftbridge just announced that they're moving their brewery to Wisconsin, right? I mean, people are leaving the state, and we have to recognize that. And, what about seniors? People, when you retire, we tax your Social Security income, and we have a huge death tax here. And they don't have that in South Dakota, Iowa, or Wisconsin. So, why should seniors stay here, right? We need to give people an incentive to stay in our community. And that's the conversation I want to have. And I'd love to have that, in the Senate or in the House if we take the majority. I think it's a good bill and a good conversation.
Well, and when that conversation is had, there's an opportunity there to make this is not an exaggeration. This is not hyperbole. This is a morally precise comparison. You're going to be exposing the people who, in this context, are supporters of the Berlin Wall. Why did the Berlin Wall exist? What function did it serve? The purpose of the Berlin Wall, the reason why they had to put armed men in turrets atop it wasn't to keep people from coming in to East Germany who desperately wanted to get there. It was to keep their own citizens from getting out. Now, why did the citizens want to leave? Is it because it was a communist socialist utopia of the type that we're aspiring to here in Minnesota? No, it's because the horrors of these terrible ideas that are currently being embraced in our state were manifesting in unlivable and tyrannical conditions. And so as you have these scenarios where companies don't want to do business here, and people feel oppressed by the policies that are being passed in St. Paul, and they decide they want to leave, whether it's physically, whether you are talking about moving and going to another state and getting taxed and exit tax or whatever previous governors, I believe Governor Dayton talked about something along those lines. Whether it's something like that or it's wanting to secede as a county and folks standing athwart and saying, no, you can't do that, you have to stay. They are morally on the same side of history as the builders and keepers of the Berlin Wall.
No, that's a really good analogy. And I've often referred, when I tell people I'm going to run to Sioux Falls to go shopping, I say, I'm going to West Berlin to get my hair cut. Or, you hear a lot of conversations about that in my neck of the woods. And I think that is a really good analogy. When I put it out on Twitter that Christy Nome tweeted, I had quickly it takes me like 20 minutes to create a little petition for people to sign, because I think as you create a bill like this and you want to try to push it at the legislature, I need to sell this to other Republicans in St. Paul that it's a good conversation. And so I want to try to get people in their districts to call their legislator, right? That's kind of how you can get momentum on bills. And so I put a petition out there where people can sign up and give me their email and their address so we know where they live. And I just checked on it here now. There is 7,158 people that have signed that petition and really signed on to the fight, which is so they're all in favor of it. And I think that's the largest number I've ever had sign a petition like this, and it shows that this bill speaks to people, and they want to be a part of it. And I've had tons of emails. I've also had some letters to the editor about how they think Munson is wasting taxpayer dollars writing bills like this that are going to go nowhere. My Mankato Free Press wrote a editorial trashing me. My response is, look, what about Democrats who write bills about mandatory electric vehicles in 15 years? Like, don't you think that bill was pretty much DOA in the Senate and not going anywhere? But this is how we work in the minority, writing bills to have discussions about legislation to show where we stand. So no, I don't think it's a waste of time to write a bill like this. That's part of our job, right? There's 2,400 bills that have been introduced so far, more than that. And this is one of those bills. Not everything's going to become law.
Well, and you're absolutely right. That opinion is not offered in good faith. They're not applying a similar standard to the side that they politically support. Let's be honest. The media supports the left. And the reason why the pushback against you and this bill is so strong, in my view, is because they recognize what I stated at the outset, which is that it's not the particulars of this proposal. It's the fact that you would dare put forward an original, bold idea that sets the agenda and lays down a narrative that they have to react to. They don't want that. They don't want other people to take the lead like you're doing and start passing bills, writing bills, and starting conversations and getting press on bold ideas that shape the conversation and require them to have a response. They like the status quo, which is being in charge, being at the wheel of the narrative in the media. And that's why they hated Trump, right? Because Trump led the charge and he didn't care what they said. And he was going to move forward with his proposals no matter what they said and dominate the conversation and force them to have a position on issues of the day. And so, I would take heart in the criticism that you've received and take it as a sign to keep moving forward.
Yeah, and I also was written up in an article on Newsweek. Not that it's a weekly magazine anymore, but it certainly has a pretty strong online presence, really among the left too. But they wrote a really long article, and it's fairly balanced about what this bill does and why I wrote it. And I think it is really a good conversation starter that we need to have in Minnesota in politics. So I think it's a good bill. Obviously, I wrote it. It's a little biased, but I think it's been a good response too.
You don't have any disagreement here. So
Yeah. All right. Well, in other news, Wisconsin today, which I guess we're recording this on Wednesday, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin overturned the governor's mask mandate. This is kind of the second time they've got rid of the mask mandate. Originally, when the Democrat governor, issued the mask mandate, the Republican House and Senate ended that mask mandate in the legislature. And then the governor reissued the mask mandate again. And now it's gone through the courts, and the courts have decided that the governor may not have been wrong in, the reason why he wants the mask mandate, but legally he can't just issue this edict through executive order. So that was a good win for people in Wisconsin.
yeah, well, and talk about West Berlin. I mean, I've used that exact same language going to Wisconsin last summer because they had similar dynamic with the business closures and the shutdown, because Governor Evers shut down the state, same as Walz did, but the Supreme Court slapped him down. Unlike our judges here, they got some good sense over there, and businesses reopened. And in Stillwater, you were killing grandma if you went to the bar. In Hudson, you could go to a restaurant and there was no problem. And strangely enough, I wasn't driving by any mass graves or people having woe and lamentation. It was a pretty normal day in Wisconsin anytime I visited there. So this is just going to add to that. Now, if I drive to Wisconsin tomorrow, which is my plan, am I going to get there and find that I can walk into a Walmart without a mask and not have to worry about a mask policy? Probably not, because now that the standard has been set and the legal and political environment has been calcified, these corporations, these companies are still going to have their policies, and they're probably still going to enforce them. But if you go to a mom and pop shop, if you stop at an antique place on the side of the road in between towns in Wisconsin, are they going to make you wear a mask? Probably not. So that the creeping freedom that we may get to enjoy as a result of this is most welcome.
Well, in Mankato, where I do a lot of shopping, when the mask mandates was not a statewide mandate, where it was based on the business, right? We had Target and Home Depot put mandates in there. And I'm sorry, no, I back it up. Menards, it wasn't Home Depot. Menards put the mandate on, but Home Depot didn't. In our town's a Menards town, right? You go to the Menards parking lot, it's full all the time. The Lowe's and the Home Depot were just desolate all the time. But when that mandate went in at Menards, Home Depot parking lot was full. Like, people, spoke with their feet and they went to Home Depot instead. And I think you'll see that if the statewide mandate is lifted in Wisconsin. Quick Trip, if they're mandating it now, they might go, gosh, people have businesses slowed down. Everybody's going to holiday because they don't, or whatever, business doesn't require it. And you'll quickly find businesses that are supportive of freedom and those that are not. And I think even if the business doesn't require it, you'll still see a lot of people walking around with masks because they support it. And that's great. That's their personal right to do that,
Absolutely.
And we've gotten, I think, as a society, we have gotten past the mask being something that, makes you look sickly, right? I mean, that was always, you would see people occasionally, especially, I'm in Rochester near the Mayo Clinic right now. A lot of people would walk around with masks in a normal year. And, because they're very concerned about their health. That's fine. But I think we're past the stigma now. People will just wear it during, flu season if they want to. But I'm anxious to see what happens in Wisconsin. In Minnesota, of course, we're trying to end the emergency in the legislature. I've filed both a state and federal lawsuit against the governor, challenging his executive orders. We've also filed a state lawsuit just solely on the mask mandate. Actually, I think that's a federal lawsuit too, because we have existing Minnesota law that actually bans you from wearing a mask in public. It's been in place. Okay. It's, you're not legally, you can't conceal your face unless it's for religious, religious headwear, or if it is part of a medical treatment, right? So a mask, you're not treating anything. It's a prophylactic.
Right.
So you're not treating anything. So it actually violates the mask mandate. Now, the difference, one of our lawsuits says the governor actually wrote his own law in direct violation of a law that was passed by the legislature, right? That's kind of the legal challenge to it. We're not saying masks don't work. We're not saying, the science is wrong. We're just saying the governor can't just write a law himself in direct violation of an existing law. And he doesn't have the power to undo existing law that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. So that was the challenge, and went to county court, and we've lost that one. But so we're continuing to challenge the mask mandate in Minnesota law too.
What was the rationale for the ruling in that loss? Do you know?
Liberalism.
Okay, I figured. I just wanted to check.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that case was in July, maybe August, and it was still when people were, scared, and it was like, wow, but you don't understand. We're in a public health crisis and unprecedented times. I think that was said a couple of times.
I gotta say, when you were just saying the thing about we're getting over the stigma, I'm one of the people that it's still super weird to me to like walk into a store and somebody's putting a mask on as they're going in. Like, I mean, a year and a half ago, if I would have seen that, I would have promptly turned around and walked in the opposite direction, because you're thinking, what in the world is this person doing? It's still weird to me.
Yeah, it is weird. And, there's also instances where it's just the science is just so wrong. I mean, personally, I just don't believe the science. I mean, we're going overboard, especially when I see somebody like on a sport bike, like anybody that drives around. I'm not a motorcycle guy, but anybody that drives around on a sport bike, it's just, they don't value their life very much. Maybe it's very dangerous, right? It comes with a great risk. And I saw a guy on a sport bike with no helmet on, but he's wearing a mask. Like, outside, that you look at it for a while and you're like, come on, really?
Yeah. Well, and that's what's been so frustrating about the science side of this conversation, is that, people have laid claim, the left in particular has laid claim to the word science, put a capital S in front of it, and turned it into a religion, where it's not science as such at all. Science as such is dominated by skepticism and requires proof and evidence and rational processes, whereas what they're proposing is do what we say when we say, even though it contradicts what we were saying last week, because we're us and we're in charge and we're the authorities and we're the experts. That's the opposite of actual science.
Yeah, one thing I'll give the pro mask people is that when we are facing a crisis in this country, people want to do something to help, right? You want to, like, when we went to war in Iraq, everybody wanted to do something. And the Republicans' response, I remember, like, get in your car and drive around or do something. Like, it was like, go waste fuel or something. It was kind of a bad response, or go shopping and, get our economy going. But when this crisis hit and people really wanted to do something, it was wear a mask. It was, do this for your neighbor. Remember the idea that you should make these homemade masks, sew these masks for hospitals because there was a PPE shortage. Minnesotans sewed 130,000 masks or whatever. I talked to people.
My wife did that. Yeah.
I talked to people at the hospitals. I'm like, are you getting all these masks that they're making? They're like, they brought in boxes of them. We just kind of throw them out. Like, they can't use them. They're not going to, they were grateful for the effort, but they're like, we can't do anything with these. We would never, these are not sanitary. The hospitals can't use them. So we accepted them and kind of disposed of them. But people wanted to do something, and that was, it was a feel good thing. People are out wearing a mask because they want to feel like they're helping to solve this problem, even though scientifically they may not be doing a lot.
Yeah, that's a great microcosm of the entire public policy approach to this pandemic, which is do something, even though it doesn't work. just to make yourself look good and feel good. It's all about appearance, optics, and feelings. Consequences be damned, results be damned. Doesn't matter if it works, only matters if it serves a political utility.
It's also really nice to wear a mask if you're out rioting. I think they found that last year that it helps conceal your identity, which is why we have a law in the books that actually says you can't wear a mask because when I
Makes sense,
interesting story, when I was back in the mid 90s or early 90s, right after the Mall of America opened, I was working there, and there was somebody walking around with a burqa, like a real burqa that covers everything, but just slit in the eyes. And they had the bunch of people surrounding them, and we had some people working at our store that were also like the chief of security at the mall, and they got a call that the suspicious person. There's actually a law in Bloomington at the time you could not conceal your identity, I think even for religious purposes. And so they confronted the person, and it was Michael Jackson. He was walking around in disguise with all of his people, but it's kind of funny. But that's why I knew about that law way back when it was on the books.
I suppose his options for disguise are limited. Or
yeah, I think so. Yeah. So on the note of on rioting, I put out a poll. We had this podcast where we had Scott Jensen on, and we talked about the commitment that Action for Liberty was pressuring him to sign, saying that he was going to support this bill to end the emergency powers. And in that commitment, it said that he would not infringe on anybody's rights. And we had this discussion about, well, what about curfews? Because curfews restrict people. You're basically confining people to their homes. And should that be allowed even during, a major crisis? I'm thinking of when a tornado comes through, or we have a fire or power outage, and people are evacuated from their homes, and they set up a curfew to keep looters from going into neighborhoods, right? If I have to leave my home because I'm being evacuated, or it's recommended I leave, I want to make sure people aren't breaking into my house and stealing my stuff. So they put a curfew on the area. And the same thing during the riots in downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul. And even Mankato put a curfew on, an 8 p.m. curfew, because there was, Black Lives Matter was coming down to Mankato to protest. Should the governor have that power was the question. And so I put it out on Facebook. Should the governor be allowed to restrict civil liberties by issuing a curfew if such curfew is limited in time, location, and scope, even during peaceful protests, to prevent others from rioting? And over 2,100 people took the poll, and 66% said no curfew ever. And 34% said yes if it's limited. I thought that was a really interesting response, kind of a follow-up to our last podcast.
Yeah, well, I was with the minority on that one. I responded to your poll, and I voted for the limited curfew. And I suppose there's a lot of language to parse out in there. What were people thinking in their minds when they read those options? What types of imagery was popping in their heads, and what was their thought process? For me, when you talk about a limited curfew, the limits that I have in mind are time and place, like highly localized, very specific, justified by reasoning that would hold up under scrutiny if it was challenged. And, perhaps these powers need to be codified in such a way that they're extraordinarily limited to where they can only be used in very specific circumstances. And with an emphasis on local control, right? So your question talked about the governor having the ability to issue curfew. Well, what if it's the city council? What if it's the mayor? An authority that's closer to home, that's more accountable to the people? What if the local authorities can override the governor's curfew or executive order or whatever it is that is being considered? I think there needs to be something. And the reason why I voted the way I did in the poll is because the whole idea, and this is a conversation that's been very robust in the liberty community over the course of the past few years during all of this Black Lives Matter stuff that's happened. A peaceful protest is no longer a peaceful protest once rioting and looting starts. I don't care if you individually have not picked up a rock or lit a match or trespassed. If you're in the streets while this stuff is taking place and you see it happening and you know it's happening, then your continued presence only acts as cover for that criminal trespass on other people's lives and other people's rights. And you know it. That's the key part for me. Because look, if it's me, if I'm at a protest, let's take it back to the Tea Party. I show up to a tea party, and this is unfathomable because it never would happen. But I show up to a tea party at the state capitol, and all of a sudden somebody starts picking up rocks and throwing them at the Capitol building or at the state office building, and they start setting things on fire, tearing down statues. Would never happen. You know, we left the place cleaner than we found it. But let's say it did. I'm hightailing it out of there. I no longer have any business in that place because lawlessness has broken out. And my objective of peaceful protest has been undermined by those criminals. And they need to be put under control and taken out of the equation before the actual peaceful protest can resume. And so that's a distinction that needs to be sorted out, I think.
I guess I disagree because I think if I'm out there with a group of people and we are peacefully protesting at the governor's mansion, we know we've done many times, if bad actors roll in who are not part of our group and they commit an act of violence, they, destroy property, they do stuff, they're not part of my group. In the moment that you think that if there's any bad actors or violent action or rioting that occurs simultaneously with a peaceful protest, that the whole thing is bad, then that means that Black Lives Matter and Antifa is going to send, a half dozen people to every conservative protest out there just to shut us down. And if we let bad actors shut down the peaceful protest, then we're not going to have any, peaceful protests going forward. So I was very careful. I made a couple of posts last year on social media during the riots for George Floyd, in recognition of the 10,000 people that are out there peacefully protesting, and the 100 or 200 bad actors out there, and making sure that we didn't call them all rioters, because there were a lot of people out there doing things the right way. And it was unfortunate that the people were rioting, doing the bad stuff. But I had to, because everybody, the conservatives especially, were out attacking everybody, talking really bad stuff about them. And I'm like, we have to recognize that every time you criticize protesters, you need to put yourself in their shoe. So if they come for your guns or if they start locking down businesses again, that could be us out there. That was us last summer. I was out protesting many times when they locked businesses down. I went out there to the governor's mansion when, was it 12,000 medical workers were laid off when he shut down all the clinics. And I was out there with all these nurses and doctors who were upset because they were out of work, even though the media was reporting hospitals are overrun with COVID patients. And there's, 12,000 people out of work.
And also not reporting that it was nurses and doctors primarily either.
Yeah.
They like to make it out like it's some fringe group or whatever.
Yeah. So, I feel like I have to always protect peaceful protesters because there would come a day, and there was, where it was me that was passionate about change. And I don't want them to, make it a felony or say, here's a free speech zone, Mondays and Wednesdays from 11 a.m. to 2 in this little area. That's my fear.
Yeah, and it's a legitimate fear, and these are difficult issues to parse out. Whenever you collectivize responsibility for something, it becomes difficult to parse out what the policy ought to be. I guess for me, the bottom line is we have a movement, a radical movement in this country on the political left, which has conscientiously and explicitly articulated their goal of overwhelming law enforcement's ability to respond to them. And they bank on the ability to mobilize numbers of people in order to overwhelm any potential for control. And that is a dangerous situation that endangers people's property rights and their rights to their persons. It endangers people physically. And there is a conversation that needs to be had about, how do we do all of the above? And I don't claim to know, but we need to have a more rigorous conversation on the right in liberty circles in particular about what that looks like. How do you maintain the right to protest while also maintaining the right of a business to operate, and the right of a resident to peacefully enjoy his property,
Yeah.
the right of a driver to use public thoroughfares.
Well, my wife and I had a deep discussion about this poll, even how it was worded, the words I use, and then on Facebook, the photos that I put above each question, like the yes, only if limited, a curfew would be okay. I put a National Guard soldier with some Humvees in an empty neighborhood, because that's what I picture when I see a curfew. But then under the no curfew ever, I couldn't just put a peaceful protest with 1,000 people walking down the street peacefully. I had to show a photo of rioters too, right? Because you get one with the other. I mean, when you say there's no curfew, that has to be not saying that you can't crack down on rioters. You can, but every police officer is going to tell you it's really hard when there's a mob of peaceful protesters that the bad actors are dodging in and out of. So there's going to be more opportunity for rioting if there's no curfew, but we have to be able to accept it. I do like your suggestion that the governor shouldn't be able to do a curfew, but the mayors could. And ultimately, what it comes down to for me is if there's a curfew, it's the police that have to enforce it, right? And it's you talk to your local. If your county sheriff says we're not enforcing this mandate, like the mask mandate, we've talked to cops in different communities. They're like, we're never going to fine you for not wearing a mask. Now, the Department of Health might, Ellison might come in and do stuff, but we're not going to do it. So you have to talk to the law enforcement too to understand if this is going to be enforced. But I like the idea of the mayor being able to do it, and that would be limited in scope because the mayor and you have more influence. If your mayor does it against your will, it's pretty easy to throw a mayor out in smaller towns at least. So that would be a good solution. One more topic I wanted to talk about in this week's podcast is the immunity passports. This has come up now. Joe Biden is very supportive of creating these immunity passports. So if you have the COVID vaccine, it's not about necessarily travel. I mean, it would include travel, but he's talking about having a passport to say that you're vaccinated in order to conduct business, in order to go into stores, to limit what you can do if you're not vaccinated. Huge violation of civil liberties, especially when you consider, not many people know this, but there are millions of Americans who cannot be vaccinated, who cannot, medically have allergies to what is in the vaccine, so they can never receive the vaccine. So now you're saying that there's a certain subclass of Americans who can't travel anymore, who are not free to travel, who are not free to go into the grocery store. And I understand that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that you make reasonable accommodation, right? If you have takeout orders or, curbside delivery, that might be reasonable accommodation. But there's so many things that, a hair salon, if you could never get your hair cut again because you don't have a vaccine passport, that's major discrimination. And of course, where does it end? Is it just for COVID? There could be vaccine passports for other diseases, or is it going to happen for a serious seasonal flu outbreak that we have next year? If there's typically 80,000 or 90,000 Americans that die of seasonal flu, could they prevent 20,000 deaths by requiring vaccines of everyone? And is that worth it? And is that going to just create we've already got immunity passports out there, so let's just require this new vaccine?
Yeah, this is a continuation along the path that was forged by the lockdowns and by the mask mandates. This is the answer to the question that no one ever asks, which is, if we do this, what precedent does it set and what does it lead to? Where do we end up? This is the answer. We go from you have to stay in your house and shut down your business and put on a mask for the common good to you now have to have papers that need to be shown to agents in order to live, in order to, because that's what we're talking about. We are talking about a license to live. Because the things that they're going to prevent you from being able to do are all of the things you need to do in order to continue to live. That's the point. And so
But now you're using the slippery slope argument, Walter, and they never respond to that,
right, because slippery slope is put forward as a prima facie fallacy when in point of fact it's not. Slippery slope is a legitimate observation of what logically happens when you remove boundaries, remove precedents, remove reason. If you don't have philosophical, moral, and legal boundaries to keep people from abusing each other, then you will get more abuse. And anybody who doesn't believe me can feel free to leave their door unlocked tonight. Okay? You do believe what I'm saying. You believe it, you just don't want to admit it. You believe it in your personal life when you build a fence around your house or lock your door or lock your business or lock your car. You believe in the necessity for boundaries and limitations. But when it comes time to actually implement that known fact of life in public policy, suddenly you conjure up some fallacious excuse or won't even bother to engage with the argument.
This idea of vaccine passports, of not being able to go into a store unless you're vaccinated. This is something that conservatives were talking about a year ago, and the left was just like, "You're crazy. You're just conspiracy tinfoil hack." I don't know how many times this happens when we say like they're coming for our guns, and then they're not coming for your guns. Oh, what's that red flag law? Like, oh, that's confiscating guns from people that haven't committed a crime. Like, it's happening, people, and
or the internet stuff, the big tech stuff that's been going on.
Yeah.
Perfect example.
Censorship, everything, right? It just keeps on coming. And so people talk about, well, this could happen, and it just gets, shut down by the liberal media of we were crazy. And sure enough, it happens. And here it is.
Yeah, there's not even a contest or dispute over whether or not that's happening. The only thing left to discuss is how short can the half-life get on this? Like, we're now at a point where the stuff, like you say, we talked about it a year ago, now it's happening. It used to be 5 years, 10 years. Think of the gap between Hillary Care and Obamacare. That was measured by a decade, right? Now we're at the point where we're turning over within a matter of months from something that when it's brought up in the public discourse is poo-pooed as wholly absurd and then is put forward as an inevitable policy that must be approved today within a matter of months.
Well, and getting back to the kind of slippery slope thing on this vaccine passport thing, I look at it as inevitably this is going to be, you say, where does it stop? But inevitably this is going to be the type of thing where companies are going to have an insurance problem if they're going to allow people to come in without their vaccine cards or whatever. And then at that point, it's kind of like government doesn't even have to put the pressure on anymore because it's baked into the cake, kind of. I mean, do you get what I mean by that?
Yeah, I've talked to some businesses about liability protection for COVID because there's been a push at the legislature to grant retroactive immunity from lawsuits to basically all businesses, not just nursing homes and hospitals that may have made bad choices during COVID and killed people, but to restaurants where people got COVID, or where people think they contracted COVID and have died or got sick or permanently damaged, or an employee, like they want retroactive immunity from lawsuits. And I said, we don't do this for the flu. I mean, not to say that COVID is the flu, but flu is a respiratory illness and it's contracted in much the same way. And tens of thousands of people die from flu. But they don't say, I'm going to sue Chili's because I had dinner there and the waitress was coughing that night, and I bet that's where I got it, And so, the minute that we grant them immunity protection, then the next disease, the courts are going to think that they should now be, liable for where this happened. I've got pain. So if they say, yeah, you have to require they have a vaccine COVID passport in order to come into your business, because otherwise, if you don't do that, your business liability insurance is going to go up. The premiums will go up because we're at risk of being sued.
That's why general liability and tort reform more generally need to undergo a refurbish. That there needs to be a broad, heavy blanket of liability protection tossed over businesses and individuals and institutions of all types, both in the state of Minnesota and nationwide, to quash this culture of litigation that strangles innovation and quite literally at this point is muzzling us and smothering us, quite literally. What the left understands is that they can use the law, they can use government, they can use policy to shape the culture. To Shane's point, the culture has shifted over the course of the past year as a direct result of the policies and the regulatory environment, the legal environment that we've been operating under with this pandemic. And what the game that the left plays is they put forward radical policies or stifling regulatory conditions. The culture changes to adjust to those conditions, and then they claim that the culture is calling for the policies that they already implemented, right? So they're like, well, people support what Governor Walz has done. People support the mask mandate. People support having businesses locked down. Well, they don't know what the alternative is. They're reacting to what they're seeing. They're being told by the authority that this is the way it has to be. If you'd asked those same people 2 years ago, do you think we ought to shut all businesses down if a more aggressive flu strain comes through? The answer would have been 90-10. No, of course not. That's absurd. Why would we ever do that? And so, that's another thing that those of us on the right need to learn, and that's modeled in legislation like your secession bill, is that we need to be shaping the culture and the conversation through our institutions, like you're doing in the legislature with bills that set the narrative.
Yeah, well, talking about the legislature, I want to throw a couple bills in here. Eric Lucero has a bill that would prevent businesses from discriminating based on whether or not someone's been vaccinated. And that would be for all vaccines. Obviously, the COVID vaccine, as we know, not everybody knows this, but the vaccine has emergency only approval. It's not a fully FDA approved vaccine, and therefore the government cannot mandate you get this vaccine until it receives its full approval. Now, Biden, of course, could push that through a little faster than normal, but it usually takes a year or 2 or 3 to get approval from the FDA. But I think that bill is interesting. Again, I'm not very supportive of it because I think that the businesses should have the individual right to, say that they don't want anybody in their business that's not vaccinated. That's kind of their choice. But I also think it's important around when we're talking about the vaccine passport, to kind of remind people that just because you're vaccinated doesn't prevent you from getting the disease, right? As we learned from Twyla last week, it's not actually going to prevent you from getting it. It lessens the symptoms. So the idea that vaccinating children who aren't at risk for having severe symptoms anyways, right? And it doesn't prevent them from spreading it. So, I think that the idea that we should be mandatorily vaccinating people or requiring them to have a passport to travel, it seems like we're really invading in their medical freedom and their medical choice. So I'm so against the vaccine card. But this week, Governor Tim Walz and former Governor Tim Pawlenty both sat side by side and got vaccinated. Which is interesting because Walz has been pushing this for a year, and neither one of these governors have been vaccinated yet. So they got their first dose today, and I think now that they're vaccinated, now everybody will probably get back. They'll be really pushing it hard. Um, but I'm very fearful of this vaccine passport. I think it's a bad idea. I think we need to be a little more honest with people about what the vaccines do and don't do, and show what their level of effectiveness is, and kind of go from there.
While I agree with your moral analysis of Lucero's bill banning discrimination by businesses of people who haven't gotten the vaccine, I do like the fact that he's put it forward for the same reason that I like your secession bill, because it forces the conversation, right? And one of the things that I think needs to be highlighted in that conversation is, why would a business think about this? This is pretty profound when you pause and really think about it. We're talking about businesses telling prospective customers, don't come here. Who in their right mind would ever do that? What incentive does a business have to tell a customer, we don't want you here, we don't want your business? And
liability.
Can I just answer one question?
Yeah.
What about a nursing home? They say you can't come in the nursing home unless you have the vaccine card, unless you have a vaccine passport.
And I think it goes back to that liability piece, right? Because if Wisconsin just lifted their mask mandate, and the Supreme Court had previously in that state lifted the governor's lockdown, so people are making their own decisions over there. And they're making their decisions based on the small s science, the actual science, and their own rational capacity and their own risk assessment, right? Of how concerned am I about getting this? How adversely affected will I be if I get this? And how much do I weigh that against the fact that I want to go to the bar, or I need to go to the grocery store, or I want to have a party or have Thanksgiving or whatever? If businesses are looking at their customer base, they would never rationally say, I want to take some percentage and say, I just don't want your business, unless the risk of allowing that person in the door is greater than the potential economic benefit. Yeah. And so that comes back to, what risk am I assessing? Am I assessing the actual health risk of contracting and spreading COVID-19, or am I assessing a legal / political risk of being sued or becoming a political pariah because I allowed people who aren't vaccinated into my business? And that's where some kind of legislation might be able to come into play.
Well, I see this, unfortunately, very much like the mask mandate rollout. Remember when the mask mandate started and you're like, I'm not wearing a mask. No way. I'm going to continue to go to businesses that don't require it. And then all of a sudden, the city of Rochester implemented a mask mandate, and because they're health leaders. And there was backlash. I mean, people from Winona, from all the communities around them, they drove to Wisconsin. They drove to other small towns to do their grocery shopping. And the businesses in Rochester felt the pain of that mask mandate. And then the mayor of Rochester pleaded with the governor, please make this statewide because people are not coming to our town to shop. You remember that? So the business owners, it started with the business owners, the Menards, right? They put the mask mandate on there. Their business suffered. They asked the city to mandate it for all because they didn't want people going down the street. The city implements it. Then they want the state, to point to government as being the one at fault. And I hope that this vaccine card doesn't get out there as a mandate, but that's kind of how I see it. Lucero's bill has good, I don't think it has teeth in the House, but it's a good conversation. But again, the businesses, you're right. Businesses aren't going to say they don't want people to come in that aren't vaccinated, but they wouldn't maybe mind it being a city mandate or a state mandate or a national mandate.
Nobody wants to stand out. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And if you're only in a context where government has the capacity to encroach upon the rights of those it is meant to protect, do you have a scenario where one person's bad policy gets solved by passing it on to everybody else? Again, we come full circle back to the rationale for the Berlin Wall. Let's move it a few miles further inland so that we can all live under the uniformity of this terrible policy.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. Shane, welcome to the show. Shane is our producer, and will be weighing in from time to time. This wraps up a great hour, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, if you want to go out and sign the petition to allow counties to leave the state, go to jeremymunson.com/joinsd. Just like join South Dakota.